key ministers, notably Shri Dharmendra Pradhan, the Union Minister of Education and Minister of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship. Also, Shri Nitin Gadkari, the Union Minister of Road, Transport and Highways. Shri Mansukh Mandavia, the Union Minister for Health. Now, we also heard from top policy makers, technocrats, pioneering entrepreneurs, and also filmmakers and corporate captains. So that's not it. Day 2 is all set to be even more grander, and that's something that we're all looking forward to. So ladies and gentlemen, we start today's proceedings with a matter straight from the heart. Now literally, I say that, why is it from the heart? Because one thing is clear. When it is coming to the healthcare system, inaction is not an option. And this is particularly relevant for non-communicable diseases, which is the NCDs, such as the cardiac occurrences or the chronic diseases. Now, NCDs are one of the major challenges for public health in the 21st century. And not only that, it also goes ahead and also relates to human suffering, which is the broader aspect of it. They also cause that kind of suffering, which also harms and inflicts upon certain situations on the socio-economic development of the country. So who better to talk about this than Professor K. Srinath Reddy? He's the former head of the Department of Cardiology at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi, and also the founding president of the Public Health Foundation of India. A winner of the Padma Bhushan Award, he is a member of the Government of India Technical Task Force of COVID-19, and today he will be speaking to us on the issue which is the subject of so many conversations at home and in offices all over the country, which is there really a sudden and sharp increase in the number of heart failures, especially among the younger people? And he'll, of course, be following it up with questions from the audience. So, Dr. Reddy, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome and invite you onto the stage, please.
Good morning. Good morning.
A warm round of applause, guys, for the good doctor. So the talk today is Heart of the Matter. Is there a heart attack pandemic? Over to you, doctor.
Heart of the matter. As a former head of the Department of Cardiology at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, where we had to look after many persons with heart disease, we know that all matters of the heart all affairs of the heart are expensive, and not merely in a poetic sense, because they extract a price in terms of death, disease, disability, and also very high expenses in terms of costly care and treatments. But now there's been a question raised as to whether heart attacks are indeed very much on the rise in India, and we are seeing newspaper reports and television reports very frequently of celebrities dying of heart attacks, quite often after they've been to the gym or in the gym, and these are people who should have been considered otherwise very healthy, and most of them had not really reported any major issue related to their heart health. And therefore, when we suddenly find these kind of reports cascading into the news channels and to the newspaper reports, there is alarm that people are indeed now much more prone to heart attacks. So I've been asked to speak on, is there an epidemic of heart attacks in this country? Well, just to clarify, the epidemic actually has been ongoing. It's been going on for quite some time, even since 1990 or even slightly earlier, but particularly since 1990 to 2020, we have seen a huge increase in the number of heart attacks in people of Indian origin, and particularly in India. So this is a public health emergency in slow motion, but nevertheless, it's a public health emergency. And this is not something that is totally new for people of Indian origin, because around 1959, for the first time in what was then Malaya, but it was actually Singapore part of Malaya, they had reported that Indians had far greater excess mortality rates, almost six-fold higher, of heart attacks compared to the Chinese, and they were mostly in younger or middle-aged population. And then subsequently, we have seen reports cascading around the world, across the world, from different countries, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Fiji, Malaysia, and also Mauritius and elsewhere too, where Indian migrants, whatever the time or climb of migration, from first generation to the third generation migrants, were all having excess risk of heart attacks and early heart attacks. So the question became fairly clear as to the excess risk, but the next question was, is it genetic or is it because of other reasons? Now, we started doing studies through the Indian Council of Medical Research funded studies in India in early 90s, and we started comparing, firstly, Indians in India with Indians in UK, and also Indians living in urban areas in India and living in rural areas in India to find out what these differences are. We also participated in major international studies like InterHeart, which looked at about 52 populations across 32 countries, and also looked at whether common risk factors explain the risk across populations, or are there specific risk factors particularly to certain ethnic groups. Now, it is very clear that InterHeart showed that there are 9 risk factors which are common globally to all populations, including to Indians. But the levels at which Indians manifest this risk is different. We actually start expressing our risk much more, in a sense, in a severe form, even at relatively lower levels of risk factors, whether it's blood pressure or whether it is LDL cholesterol or total cholesterol or so. So the question became, is it genetic, or is there some other predisposing factor which sort of identifies why these people are at excess risk? And that is getting precipitated by our living habits, which are changing quite rapidly with modernity. So when we looked at it, it was very clear that when you compare Indians living in the UK, for example, with Afro-Caribbeans and white Caucasians living in UK, things like diabetes, fairly high deposition of fat in the abdomen, and either what's called insulin resistance, and certain abnormalities in the fat, like low levels of the protective HDL cholesterol, these and high levels of triglycerides, these appear to be particularly common among Indians. But when we started looking at urban and rural comparisons in India, then it became very clear that the conventional risk factors like high blood pressure and smoking, obesity, and high levels of serum cholesterol, they appear to explain the risk between urban and rural Indians. Indeed, we also did a factory study in which we looked at factory workers in big cities of India who had migrated recently in 5 years or slightly earlier to urban areas and compared them with their siblings who had stayed back in rural areas. And there we found that within 5 years of urban migration, what we can call urban acculturation, every single risk factor went up in those who had come to the cities. Blood pressure, body weight, blood glucose, blood cholesterol, name it and you have it. So it is very clear that instead of blaming the genes we share, we perhaps should be looking at the genes we wear. Are we still fitting into last year's genes or not? And one of the things that is very clear now is this abdominal fat, which is deposited much more around the organs of the abdomen, is much more predictive of risk of both diabetes and heart attacks than what is conventionally measured as the body mass index, which is the ratio of weight to height. Because it's been found that people of Indian origin generally manifest risk at what is considered to be normal body mass index, fairly high risk. That is because body mass index only measures height and weight, doesn't explain whether the weight is because of bones, whether because of fat, or because of body fluids. What exactly is it? It doesn't explain very clearly. And muscle, mostly. So, on the other hand, now it is increasingly believed that a simple measure like what we can call waist to height ratio, just measure the waist circumference and the height, and if it is more than 50%, then you are at a risk of diabetes, heart attacks, and a number of other chronic diseases. And this is a tailor-made measure for us, which we can easily have measured without difficulty. But then the question, of course, is, why is it that persons who appear to be fairly healthy are suddenly having heart attacks? Firstly, let me explain the difference between heart attack and angina. When blood vessels are diseased because of fat deposition, and there are blockages of 70% or more, that affects the flow of the blood. Particularly when you exercise and your body demands more blood and more oxygen, then the blockage actually prevents that extra blood from reaching the heart or reaching the muscles, and the heart actually has to strain much more. That is angina, which you get on effort. That's because of blockages of 70% or more. But heart attacks have a different pathology. You can get a heart attack with even a 30% block, with a soft plaque. So if there is a soft plaque, which normally does not cause any problem, even on exercise, but if there is a condition which actually makes the plaque rupture, then the exposed surface of the fibrous fatty core of that plaque then gets exposed to the blood flowing in the blood vessel, and that triggers a huge clot that blocks the blood flow and causes a heart attack. And now, therefore, we have to understand what destabilizes the plaque. We know that sudden rise in blood pressure can do it, a lot of stress can do it, smoking can do it, a very fatty meal can do it, and lack of sleep, which can cause a lot of inflammation in the body. Now, inflammation is the key word, whether it is diabetes, or whether it is bad lipids, whether it's lack of sleep, whether it's stress, all of them ultimately cause inflammation in the body, and they break down the plaque, even if it may be small, but if it's a soft plaque and if it gets broken, then... So no wonder somebody seems to be very healthy, used to exercise, but has had a relatively sleepless night, goes and does vigorous exercise, and suddenly the plaque ruptures because of the extra adrenaline and catecholamines that are flowing in. And it is also very clear that now moderation is the key. We have all been told that a lot of good exercise is wonderful, but recently a lot of data have come in that people who do very vigorous exercise very frequently are at greater risk of atherosclerosis. They have greater risk of cardiac rhythm abnormalities. Similarly, too high in HDL. HDL is supposed to be the protective cholesterol. But anybody who has more than 80 is actually at a higher risk of heart attacks. So better keep it above 45, preferably around 50, but certainly not above 80. Similarly, LDL is supposed to be the bad cholesterol. But people with less than 70 milligrams of LDL cholesterol are now shown in studies to be at a higher risk of heart attacks. So we are now beginning to recognize moderation, and the middle path is probably the best, except for tobacco. No smoking, no tobacco product of any kind, anytime. Similarly, fruits and vegetables, of course, you can take plenty because they're protective. So these are important lessons that we are learning, that heart attacks occur because of reasons which are slightly different from that of angina. The overall risk factors like diabetes, blood pressure, high cholesterol, high triglycerides, low HDL, all these are common. But whereas angina occurs because of chronic buildup of these fatty plaques, which grow and start blocking the blood supply, heart attacks can happen suddenly when the plaque breaks down, if it is soft, and then triggers a huge clot. So the important thing is that we try and maintain some of these things under control in terms of risk factors. And now, why is it that COVID is also now supposedly causing higher amount of risk? We know that COVID triggers inflammation. As I said, inflammation is the key word. And COVID triggers inflammation throughout the body. COVID triggers blood clots in the veins as well as in the arteries. It can cause large clots to block the coronary arteries, which are supplying blood to the heart. It can also cause what are called microinfarcts in the small blood vessels of the heart. And they can also cause electrical abnormalities and lead to sudden cardiac arrest. So COVID, because of the inflammation, is also triggering heart attacks. And that is something that we ought to be, and it destabilizes plaques. So that is the reason why we have seen an increase in recent years, particularly of what are reported to be COVID-related deaths. And a celebrity who has recently recovered from COVID goes to the gym after a relatively sleepless night of partying and does vigorous exercise, and next day appears in the headlines as a sudden unexplained death at the age of 40 or 45. So that is the problem. Now, one of the things that we must recognize is that heart attacks are indeed occurring at a relatively earlier age in India, but it is also true that they're increasingly occurring among poorer people. Whenever the pandemic of heart attacks starts, any country, or the epidemic of heart attacks starts in any country, it usually starts in the richer sections who have greater access to fatty diets. They have greater access to labor-saving devices like cars, and even tobacco started first in the fashionable smoking rooms of London, but now it is there in every street corner of almost every low and middle income country. So we recognize that over a period of time, those who are rich and educated start understanding why these are occurring and adopt healthier lifestyles. They give up tobacco, they undertake more exercise, and then they also try and take healthier diets, more fruit and vegetables. So whereas now tobacco, ultra-processed foods, all the sachets that you see of ultra-processed foods, they're there in every street corner, and healthy edible oils become less affordable to the poor people compared to unhealthy edible oils. So over a period of time, heart attacks become much more frequent among the poorer sections of the people. But it is absolutely important that we recognize that these transitions are happening and also create environments in which people can lead healthy lives. Now, even if you look at urban environment, pollution is a major challenge. Pollution, again, builds up atherosclerotic plaque in the blood vessels. It raises blood pressure, and it destabilizes plaque. Even a relatively small plaque can rupture again and cause an acute heart attack. Sudden cardiac deaths and sudden heart attacks have been known to people exposed to high levels of pollution. They also trigger arrhythmias. At the same time, our cities are becoming difficult for regular exercise. And for poor people, that's going to be a constraint. We don't have community spaces where people can easily exercise. In fact, previously, people used to be paid for doing physical activity. Now people have to pay for doing physical activity by paying for gym membership. So we need to build healthier cities with less pollution, with opportunity for more pleasurable and safe physical activity, have tobacco-free spaces, and particularly ensure that our children are growing up healthy, because childhood obesity is becoming a major problem in India. And even obesity, if you're really looking at it, the latest NFHS 5, the National Family Health Survey 5, in adults in India reported that 24% of the adults in India were obese, overweight or obese, even by the conventional standards. Leave aside the waist-height ratio. And 19% in rural areas and 33% in urban areas. And just to give you a figure, when my former colleagues in All India Institute of Medical Sciences, along with people in Chennai, conducted a major diabetes study, but not just diabetes, pre-diabetes, what's called dysglycemia, other indicators of pre-diabetes also combined with diabetes. In Delhi, among adults above age of 20 years, 72% of men and 73% of women were found to have dysglycemia, or unacceptable glucose levels, diabetes or pre-diabetes. So that is the kind of catastrophe that we're walking into. Plus, of course, in terms of stress-related issues, there is a challenge about increasing stress in modern life. Stress is actually a protective phenomenon to some extent, because we do need a certain amount of stress, particularly when there are emergencies. Acute stress is required. If you're walking on the street and suddenly a DTC bus rushes at you, you can't say, "Ki farak panda," right? So there is a certain amount of stress that saves you. You have to jump up and protect yourself. So stress is protective. But too much of stress, particularly chronic stress, and particularly situations where you have very little control of how to manage the stress, that actually continues to create inflammation, erode the organs of your body, especially blood vessels, and create atherosclerosis as well as rupture soft plaques. So in terms of stress, just remember this. Stress is like a musical string instrument. If your strings are too lax, they don't make good music. If your strings are too taut, they don't make good music. So just the right amount of stress is what is optimal for us. So I think there are a number of ways in which Indians can protect themselves in very many ways. But some of the things that we must recognize is that even when we are talking about blood tests or blood pressure or blood glucose, any of these, we do recognize that most of them operate in a moderate band, neither too low or too high. And it is important for us to maintain that moderation, even in terms of physical exercise, etc. And then we will be able to avoid the heart attacks. But indeed, heart attacks are rising in this country, and they're affecting people across all social classes, in all parts of India. Both genders are affected, and therefore it's absolutely important for us to prevent the heart attacks as well as we can by creating conditions where we can make and maintain healthy living habits, but also following certain simple rules by which we can protect our hearts. Thank you very much. So any questions? I'll be happy to take some questions.
Aman there from News18 India. Yeah.
Dr. Saab, we are used to having annual preventive health checkups. But after hearing you, do you think we should have more frequent health checkups, like a lipid profile, like other health checkups? And another thing I wanted to ask you, that if there is one thing that you would advise everybody to not do so that you don't get a heart attack, what should that one thing be?
Okay. You should not expose yourself to tobacco actively or passively. That's a critical element. But the second element about your health checkups, I believe that health checkups are useful, but quite often they can be misleading if they do not give you an overall evaluation. Risk is never usually predicated on a single risk factor. Of course, if you have got a very high blood pressure, 210 by 130, then of course you're in trouble because of that. But mostly it is moderate elevations of many risk factors which together create the situation of a heart attack. Slightly elevated blood glucose, slightly elevated LDL cholesterol, slightly depressed HDL cholesterol. These are the various things that combine. So it's important for you to recognize that you have to modify all of them in general. The second thing is people with even a so-called seemingly normal cholesterol can get heart attacks because it is not just the ratio of HDL to LDL that matters. In LDL itself, there is a thing called small dells LDL, which is much more atherogenic than the big buoyant LDL. And people with diabetes, people with pre-diabetes, and many Indians, unfortunately, tend to have high levels of small dense LDL fraction. And that causes a problem. Now, this is not usually measured, even in your executive checkups. Now, how does one do it? Because it's expensive. So there is a ratio of triglyceride to HDL, which ideally you should be keeping it below 3:1, preferably below 2:1, but above 3:1 sort of spells danger. So these are some of the things that you must learn to recognize. Next.
Okay, I believe we have one more question. Yes, the gentleman in the gray suit.
Yeah, I'm Major General Sanjay Soi. Thank you so much for wonderful talk. Just a couple of things. In spite of maintaining good diet, at times, and like one doesn't have diabetic, one is not high blood pressure, but still gets a lot of very high cholesterol. Is there anything hereditary to do with it? Will the DNA test help in selecting the diet?
Yes. Actually, there is a hereditary component to many of these things, but the actual genetic component explains only less than 10%, all put together. However, in some group of people, familial hypercholesterolemia, there is a very clear-cut genetic predisposition. And there are a number of drugs that have been developed now which can significantly reduce that, the PCSK9 inhibitors, which are very useful. But they also act in others with elevated cholesterol. And more importantly, now they're showing that they are having a remarkable effect in reducing the risk of heart attacks. So they're being used quite effectively for diabetes and also for dyslipidemia now. They're being used in combination. So it's being the PCSK9, particularly for familial hypercholesterolemia.
Just hang on. We'll just hand over the mic to you, sir. Yeah.
Doctor, I am Major Muhammad Ali Shah. And just not a question, just a statement that, you mentioned about earlier we would get paid to keep fit. Now we pay to keep fit. Well, in the armed forces, they pay us to keep fit, sir.
Wonderful.
Thank you, sir.
Well, I think we should motivate ourselves. But the message is that we must create conditions for pleasurable and safe physical activity in the community as well as in schools and, if possible, in work sites. That's important. We must not make it difficult for people to do physical activity.
One more here. So, please wait for the mic. I request all of you to please raise your hand so that we are able to pass the mic.
Is it something to do with luck also? There's a lot of diabetic, heavy diabetes, people high on alcohol. Kushwant Singh died at 97. Biggest alcohol guy with diabetes. What a womanizer also. But the Iyengar yoga
Are
guru,
you saying it's a protective factor? Okay.
and Iyengar guru died at 88. So it has something to do with luck also, I think.
Well, there will always be some exceptions. I go to schools to talk to school children, and they say that my grandfather smoked. Somebody gets up and says, my grandfather smoked, but he lived up to the age of 80. And this is the classical Winston Churchill example. Winston Churchill used to smoke like a chimney, but he'd lived up to 89 or whatever. So the, please think of traffic signals. You're not supposed to drive through a red light. If you rush through a red light, the likelihood of the probability of you getting an accident is much higher than if you stop at a red light. Of course, sometimes in Delhi, even if you stop at a red light, some car will come and bump you from behind. So some people who observe the rules also will get heart attacks, minority. Some people who do not observe the rules, early morning, hardly any traffic, you rush through a red light, you won't get an accident. Some people who do not observe rules because of combination of other factors do not get the heart attack. But they are also in a minority. For majority, the vast majority, the rules will apply. That if you have these risk behaviors and risk factors, you are likely to get much greater risk of heart attacks. But we do not know what protective factors Mr. Kushwant Singh had. Otherwise, maybe he was less stressed. Maybe he had ate much healthier diet. We have no idea. So, socialization is also important. I mean, so social networks, we don't know. Anyway, but do not think that you can live like the few who are exceptions, because you may then succumb to the problem like the majority who are not exceptions.
All right, we have time for one last question. I know all of you would like to ask a lot of questions from Dr. Reddy, but one last question. We just wait for the mic, sir. The mic is reaching you. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, Dr. Reddy, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Here this side, sir. As a father to a 4-year-old daughter who thinks that the purpose of heart is to miss Papa when he's not around, so what should I do to ensure that when she grows up, she has a healthy heart?
So basically, women are better protected against heart attacks than men, up to menopause or even some years after menopause. That's because of various hormones, female sex hormones, and their HDL cholesterol levels are generally higher than that of men. So in general, they're better protected. However, that protection disappears in women who smoke, women who take contraceptive pills regularly, and women who are diabetic, women who are obese. So best thing for you to tell her is to eat a good diet and be physically active, and certainly not marry a smoker.
All right, Doctor, I'd now like to take a liberty to ask a question of you. Doctor, if you allow me. Dr. Reddy.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, since you mentioned about women having less heart attacks, we've just had a recent example of an actor who's very, very fit, Sushmita Sen, and the fact that there's a lot of misinformation on social media, especially to do with the vaccines. They say people who are now vaccinated are getting early heart attacks. How does one cull all of that misinformation? And then of course, when you have celebrity cases like a Sushmita, like a Siddharth Shukla, how does one deal with it?
Well, as far as vaccines are concerned, currently there is a fair amount of work going on in the UK as well as in the US to see whether some of the vaccines they have used have been responsible for heart problems. Some of them have been responsible for myocarditis, that is inflammation of the heart muscle, not so much heart attacks as such. Even there, people who have had COVID have had a greater occurrence of myocarditis than people who have received vaccines, but definitely myocarditis is known. But it's also known that the AstraZeneca vaccine and those kind of vaccines, the virus vector vaccines, also in some cases, again a small minority of cases, have resulted in venous and arterial thrombosis, so they can form clots. So some association is there, but in general, people who are vaccinated have much better health outcomes than people who are not vaccinated. Now, as far as some of the celebrities are concerned, I do not know the specifics of the lady you're mentioning. I think that's the lady you're hinting at. But I do not know what all factors contributed, whether smoking was a common feature, whether there was a lot of stress. We do not know what exactly are the reasons. But in general, as I said, women premenopausally, if they do not smoke, if they're not diabetic, if they do not take oral contraceptive pills, they are much better protected than men. But after menopause, in about 5 to 10 years, that protection disappears. But also, If women are diabetic, even before menopause, that protection disappears because nothing reduces HDL cholesterol or the good cholesterol like smoking and diabetes.
Okay, Dr. Reddy, I don't think they are willing to let go of you just yet. I believe there's one last question from the audience. I'd request, okay, Rakesh there has a question, yes.
Sure.
Hi, sir. So so many people are asking, and I also have a doubt, like we have been taking vaccines, we have taken 3 vaccines. So is that also one of the reason to get heart attacks?
Well, this is exactly what I was mentioning, that as far as the inactivated virus vaccine is concerned, there is absolutely no risk association with clotting. Whereas the virus vector vaccines, whether it is the AstraZeneca or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, have been shown in a small number of cases to be associated with increased risk of clotting. And they may be associated with heart attacks. But there's a huge study going on in the US as well as in UK, putting all the data together to analyze whether this risk is high or not. But in general, we know that people who have had COVID during the immediate hospitalization phase or even after discharge are much more prone to blood clotting. And that's why they are advised, people who have been in intensive care or in hospital, for at least 6 weeks, they're advised anticoagulation after discharge. So the question is, are vaccines 100% safe? Probably not. Are they worse than getting COVID? Certainly not.
All right, thank you so much, Doctor. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Dr. Reddy. Dr. Reddy, please request you to stay on the stage, and I'd like to also invite now News 18's Mr. Jyoti Kamal. Dr. Reddy, please stay on the stage. We just to felicitate you. Yes. Big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for Dr. Srinath Reddy. Thank you so much, Dr. Reddy and Mr. Jyoti Kamal. That was a very, very engaging session to start day 2 of Rising India Real Heroes. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to once again thank Dr. Reddy for being with us and taking all your questions. So I hope that you enjoyed this session. Can we have more engagement like you were all engaged and ineptly listening to what Dr. Reddy was saying? Did you enjoy the session? In rapt attention, all of you. Okay, that's quite an engaging audience. I believe you had all your questions answered. If not, then you can actually go and get in touch with Dr. Reddy backstage. Hound him. Are they allowed to do that? Dr. Reddy, I'll take his reactions slightly later, but thank you so much for being